Quick introduction on my side. As introduced, my name is Mashhood, and I work as the CTO at Sustainability.pk. Sustainability is a startup based here in Karachi, where we are working to build the travel e-commerce platform for Pakistan. I'm also something called a Google Developer Expert. That's essentially a title given to me when we participate in this program from Google, and we're essentially doing a lot of the community outreach and community support with Google technologies and some not related Google technologies as well. Um, so essentially, what we're talking about is what are the differences between desktop to mobile, so that we have a essential idea why we want to build the mobile app in the first place, right? So hopefully this has given you some idea around, okay, this is why I need to, what these are some of the things I need to think about when I'm trying to build my app. So, and that kind of justifies why I'm building it in the first place. All right. So once you've figured out why you want to build your app, the next obvious question is how. And this is a very high-level view of some of all the different ways we'll be talking about today on how you can go ahead and build your mobile app. Now, before we go into this, I just wanted to do a very high-level overview of all of these things, and starting off, obviously, with from the right side with the native apps. So in 2004, when Steve Jobs announced the iPhone, at that time there wasn't any app store. Mobile apps didn't really exist like they do today. There used to be some Java apps that were not very portable. They weren't very friendly. Smartphones themselves were not something that everyone was using everywhere. But I think it was in 2007 or 8, they announced the iOS App Store, and then very soon the Android App Store came in, and that kind of shifted everything, and everybody got really interested in building on this platform because there were so many people buying these phones. So initially, the only way to build apps was to create a native app in iOS with using Objective-C, and in Android using Java. And that was the case for the first few years. But as this thing got more and more popular, more and more money was poured in, people started to think, okay, what are other ways we can deploy our apps onto this platform and keeping in mind, how can we reduce cost? How can we make it more efficient? How can we deploy faster? And people were just trying to see what other ways could be used to do the same thing at the end of the day. So the result of that is essentially what you see here. Very soon after the native apps kicked in, the hybrid apps came in to the picture. One of the first few companies was PhoneGap that essentially introduced the concept where we had this wrapper around a web view. We'll talk about this more in a bit. And the hybrid apps then just took the world by storm. And I don't know if you guys remember, but around 2011, 2012, Facebook's own app was a hybrid app initially, and they've taken a bet on the web at that point. Unfortunately, web wasn't ready then, so then they shifted over to the native app after 2 years. So after that, after hybrid apps came the compile to native apps, and these are apps that we write in any other language. They're not written in Swift or Kotlin that we use today to write native apps, and they kind of are cross-platform. So I write my code base once, and then I can deploy it on Android and iOS, and any third party if I want to at the same time. So that's considered something that's very useful. You can use things like JavaScript to write code, so that's also very fast. So these platforms have really taken over the last few years. And finally, PWAs are just mobile websites. And again, we'll go into detail on these. And these are the most newest players on the web. And if you look at it from one perspective, this is essentially web taking back control of the mobile platform. So these are just mobile websites that are optimized for mobile in a very specific way, and that essentially gives the user a really good native experience, but using the web. So this was a very quick high-level overview of how the platforms have been changing over time, and now we're just going to go in detail into each one of them and see how they stand against each other. So in order to get a good high-level overview for each of these platforms, we want to look at a few different things. The first one is performance. And this is all about the feel of the app, right? Is it laggy? Is it fast? Is it smooth? How fast does it start up, right? That's obviously a huge concern. If the app takes like 5-6 seconds to start up, it's not considered to be a good thing. So all of that comes under performance. We're going to talk about accessibility, and that's around how easily can a user find my app. Now, a few of these metrics are essentially pitching between web versus mobile. So, and this is one thing where we're going to be talking about where web versus mobile is better. Offline support. So we've talked about connectivity. So offline support is crucial. And again, this will usually matter on your app, but at least you want to have some sort of engagement when you're offline. And in some cases, you want to have a completely functional app when you're offline. So that will completely depend on what you're trying to build. Native integrations are all the native functionality of your phone. So that includes things like camera, push notifications, access to contacts, geolocation, all of that. Again, this will vary across different platforms as we go from web to pure native. Cost of development is one of the most important things. And within cost of development, you also have to think about how easy is it to actually find resources for this particular team, right? So that's something, again, we'll touch on. And the final one is the speed of iteration. And this is also interesting because a lot of the companies nowadays, when they're building these apps, they want to build something and then iterate with user feedback really quickly. And we'll talk about how app stores can be a bit limiting because you need to get your app approved before you actually get it deployed again after each version. And those who are following Twitter and the tech world, they'll know about Hey.com's latest news that they essentially got approved initially, but when they pushed an update, it's a mail app, and they weren't using in-app payments, so there was some conflict, and their app got rejected for a week or two before it got accepted again. So things like that can become barriers when you're deploying to the App Store. So these were our metrics, and we'll compare these metrics across each platform as we go into them. So the first platform we're going to talk about are PWAs. Well, the full form is Progressive Web Apps. And this point was actually termed by Google a couple of years ago when they have been pushing for mobile first and mobile friendly websites for a while, as we see more and more of our traffic being shifted from desktop to mobile apps. So on average, our website also gets about 60 to 70% traffic on mobile now. So it's very obvious now that mobile is the future, and how do we make our web better for mobile apps? Just in terms of not just websites, but then how do you take it a step further and give those web apps functionality that most people would like to have in their apps? So one example over here is having an icon on the home screen. So if you have your mobile app that loads up, and then you get this notification below that asks you to install it, so you don't have to go to the App Store or anything else. You just click over there on the web, and boom, you have an icon on your home screen. So that's something that's part of PWAs. There's also stuff like push notifications. There's also something called service workers that allows really good offline support. So you can actually, once the website has been loaded on the device, you can access almost the whole website, whatever you cache locally, offline completely, and you can even cache your API calls locally, and you can control the caching in any way you like. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening right now around PWAs that has got a lot of people excited. And you can essentially see this, the output of this, in all the different apps that you might even use today. So you have heard of the Lite apps that have come out over the last few years. So Facebook has the Messenger Lite, the Facebook Lite, Twitter has the Twitter Lite app, and all of the Google Suite is now moved to Lite, be it Gmail or Maps or whatever. So the whole point of these light apps is that they're just websites, and they're essentially being converted to PWAs. And when I say converted, there's not much additional code that you're writing really. It's more of a mindset that you're thinking of. And when you enable some things like a manifest file and the service worker, you get all of that functionality that you're looking for. So this is something that's super cool, and definitely that is building up right now, and this looks really promising for our future. I will add one more thing over here, and that is that a lot of these light apps are actually focused for this very region, the region of Southeast Asia. And that's because light apps are usually consuming very few resources. They're meant to be a very, very stripped down version in terms of performance and memory usage and disk usage. So if you're using a cheap Chinese phone, then PWAs are amazing. And even for myself, I tend to use all of the light apps for myself because I just like the performance of them so much. So PWAs are super cool and definitely worth checking out if you're trying to build a mobile app that's meant to be web-centric. So one new thing that has come up within the PWA space is called TWAs, and this is something that's specific to Android right now. TWAs are trusted web activities, and what this does is it allows your PWA to be available in the Android App Store with very minimal effort. And so this is like making your PWA into a hybrid app, but instead, you don't actually have to make the app. You just have to go to the Play Store and publish it as an app, and that's it. Google does all of the work for you, and you're serving your website from the domain to the device, and you get your full screen experience, the whole shebang, right? It's super useful, it's super cool, but it feels native. But at the end of the day, it's just a web app, and this is, again, very useful, but this is also very cutting edge. So not many platforms have come on to as trusted web activities. We're still figuring out how to properly use them. So I've done some experiments around here. So this is definitely needs some work before it goes prime time. But again, you can already get the idea that how the blend between web and mobile apps, the Play Store, is slowly going away with things like trusted web activities coming in. So if you want to compare PWAs just across the board with our metrics, so if you look at performance, PWAs are meant to be super fast. One of the requirements of PWA is that you need to load the app in under 3 seconds in order to consider for it to be a PWA, right? So it has to be very lean and super fast. So obviously when it's that fast, it's going to load up very fast, usually under 1 second, and that's pretty consistent across all PWAs that you'll use. However, since you are on the web platform, so essentially you're in a web container, web can sometimes get slow because it's running on a single thread. And if you're doing something that's highly computative, like playing a game or something like that, then you will experience some lag on some devices, right? So this is something to be careful about. This is something to keep in mind effectively, because if your app requires high computative stuff, like a lot of drawing or rendering, then this platform is probably not the best option for you. So accessibility, we've talked about web versus mobile app play stores. So this is the web side of things. So it's instantly available the second you deploy it. There's no approvals required. You don't have to get an iOS developer account, an Android developer account. You don't have to create any builds, just a cloud service. You push your code and you're done. On the consumer side, again, you have a huge win because you don't have to download anything. You share a URL, the user clicks on it, and 2 seconds later, they can access your app, they're using it, and they're experiencing what's there, right? And you get all of the cool things like the icons on the home screen, you get some basic push notifications and all of that. So, you know, it's a pretty big step in terms of, hey, what sort of users am I looking for? If my app is more of a thing where a person might use it every once in a while, then this is something to think about, because they'll just use the app very quickly by going on the URL and then just get rid of it. So there's no point in having them download this huge 60 MB app when it's a single time use app sometimes. Offline support is good. You have to configure service workers like I've talked about before. Configuring service workers can get a little bit tricky sometimes, and is not as nice as the native cache that's available on the native platform. So this is something that, again, you have to weigh across. So if offline support is something that is crucial, that is critical to your application, then the web is getting there. You need to make an extra effort to make it perfect. So so then native platforms kind of look to be the better option sometimes. Native integration, we have limited native integration right now. So we have some basic functionality you've probably already seen. You can use the camera, you can use file pickers, things like that. You have some basic push notification capabilities. So text-based notifications can go through. You have very, very limited background process and geo as well. So if you want some location stuff, you can get that. But anything more than basic is generally not there, right? So again, if your app is looking to be using any of the native functionalities, then the web, again, isn't there yet, but it is slowly moving in that direction. Cost of development is the big factor here. So, and web developers are relatively cheap to mobile developers or mobile app developers. So this is generally where most of the people start thinking about, okay, this might be a good option just because it's just going to be cheap and fast to build. And if you talk about speed of iteration, since again, you're on the web, you don't have any approval process, you can deploy 30 times a day with different iterations, and there's no one to stop you, and you know, it's super, super fast. So this is, again, very useful if you have something that is on a prototype scale and you're looking to ship those little changes throughout the day and test out the waters with your app. The next category of apps that I want to talk about are hybrid apps. And hybrid apps are essentially mobile apps that are essentially a web mobile website that you put in a wrapper, essentially that is the native wrapper. And when you do that, when you put that website in a native wrapper, it's just the browser essentially. There's nothing else to it. It's just the browser. But because you're in a native wrapper, now you can actually tap into the native functionality as well, right? That's why they're called hybrid. And what you can do is you can mix screens between the two. So you can have your one screen that is just pure web and loads in a web page, but then you can have your next screen that is purely native, right? So you actually open a native view that's built in iOS and Android separately, and it does some particular functionality that is super computative or whatever. You can also take a portion of your screen and render that natively, right? So it could be like a nav bar or something like that to give a native experience. So hybrid apps are super cool in that sense, that you can do the mix and match. So if most of your app is web and then there's some parts that need to be native, you can go for that. You get obviously the full push notification spec. You get native integrations into all your different marketing tools and things like that, right? So hybrid apps are definitely a jump up, and they are also a very popular option when building mobile apps nowadays. Uh, One specific type of hybrid apps, there's a library called Ionic, and this is one of the more popular ways of building hybrid apps. So what Ionic does, Ionic is a UI kit for Android and iOS. So essentially, I build my app using JavaScript and HTML and CSS. But as you can see with the screenshot on the side, I get this very native looking like UI by using Ionic, and I get some really good performance out of the box. I get all the animations and all of the things that a user would expect from a native app. And Ionic apps are actually very hard to distinguish between native and web. So this is definitely a very popular option if you're going down the hybrid route. So definitely worth checking out. Within this space, if you are looking for, if you have a custom website that you want to deploy, there are two different tools. One is called Cordova, and the other one is called Capacitor. Capacitor belongs to Ionic, and essentially these are two build tools that help you create that wrapper around your app, and they essentially give you functionality of the native app into your web app. So you can call like the file storage system or something like that from your JavaScript code. So if you look at how hybrid stands when compared to web and native, so one place where it loses out, because now you have this native wrapper and compiler and all of the libraries around your website, the loading time gets impacted. So the overall hybrid apps are known to have a slightly slower loading time. And when I say slow, I'm not talking about 20 or 30 seconds. It's usually 5 to 6 seconds, and it's slightly noticeable. You can obviously shave it down, but there's a limit to how much you can shave it down, because you still have to ship the libraries and the wrapper itself, right? So that has some size. Accessibility, now you have moved into the App Store, so you can obviously look up stuff on the App Store and find it, and that's generally not easy on its own, so that's something to think about. But and now you also have this issue that you have to download the app, and if your bundle size is relatively big, then and if the user's on the move, let's say I'm out about and I have to download this huge 60 or 90 MB app, then usually it's something that's very hard for me to do, right? So that becomes a downside of things. So that's again something to think about. Bundle sizes tend to grow big when you use these pseudo platforms, and then when you go onto the pure native side, they tend to shrink back up again. Offline support, again, now you have the best of both worlds. So you can either use completely native caching or the service workers. That's completely up to you, or you can use the mix of two. So this was something Facebook was trying to do back in 2012. So at that time, the web wasn't ready at all, but now it's come a long way more. So I think this is a really good combination when it comes to giving offline support. Native integrations, now since you have the native capability, you can essentially do anything you want in terms of native integrations. And like I said, you can have complete views that are built in native on your app, right? So you can click a button and that will launch a completely native view that's done in iOS or Android separately. Cost of development is again still cheap, especially if your views are mostly web and you've just added a few screens where you need the native experience. An excellent example that I did a few years ago was this chatting application, this video call application. So most of our UI was very simple. It was just choosing appointments and schedules, and that was all in Ionic. But then there was this one part where we were doing the video call, and since video call is very competitive, of course, if you try doing that on the web, you would definitely run into problems with performance. So that was the part where we would launch a native SDK and give a native experience, right? So that only part was native, everything else was web. So again, we were able to move super fast and get that delivered quickly. The next one up is speed of iteration. And hybrid apps have this unique functionality where you are a native app, so you are in the Play Store, and you can also do what's called updating on the fly. So you can pull in the latest web files, and you can update the app without getting an approval through the App Store. So this is again, sometimes it causes issues in the Play Store, but normally it's something that's pretty common. A lot of apps do this. So this is an option with only hybrid apps, and again, something to think about if you're planning to do a lot of quick iterations, maybe something on a daily basis or a weekly basis. And just so that you have that comparison in mind, on iOS, if you submit an app, the first time you have to wait for at least 10 days before it gets approved. And then for every version that you push, you have to wait 2 to 3 days before it gets approved. So that is kind of the minimum thing that you have to wait for before you can release the next version. So that's something, again, that comes into play. The next brand of apps, I'm going to talk about these three different frameworks: React Native, Xamarin, and NativeScript, that essentially compile to native. And what does this mean? What does this compile to native? And so I touched on this before briefly. And what we're trying to do here is we're writing code in a third language. So we're not writing code in Swift or Android, or Kotlin for Android. And so React Native is mostly JavaScript or TypeScript. Xamarin is C#, NativeScript is TypeScript. And this code essentially gets compiled to native code in real time when you're running the app. So you write everything in JavaScript or TypeScript, and when your app is built and run, it will convert that code into the native code. And the way it does that is it uses something called a JavaScript bridge. So there is a web view that runs your JavaScript code in the case of React Native and NativeScript, and it sends over instructions over this bridge to the native app and tells it, say, hey, look, now you have to draw a button over here, or now you have to build a list over here, or an input screen over here, or show modal over here, and things like that, right? So at the end of the day, everything you see is native, and that's super fast, super performant. But the drawing part is not native. So that's being transpiled at runtime from JavaScript to native, right? So if you have a quick look over the overall performance, so starting from the load times are still slow. I would imagine they're slightly faster from hybrid apps, but still nowhere as fast as pure native apps. Again, for most people, this may or may not be a concern, so definitely try out some of these apps before making a call. Runtime is native, so yes, it's fast, but like I mentioned, because of the JavaScript bridge, that can become a bottleneck if you're trying to do something very computative, or you're trying to create too many components. Again, this happens stuff around if there's like a game or something like that, where a lot of interaction is required, that might cause some bottlenecks. But React Native is considered to be an industry standard. It's super fast. Obviously, Facebook built it. They use it a lot as well. So you usually are not going to run into that bottleneck that quickly. So it's generally considered super fast. Accessibility, again, since we're in the App Store, so we have to download the app. And because with all of these three platforms, you have to ship the compiler, the React Native compiler, and all the libraries with your bundle. So because of that, your bundle size is relatively large, right? So this is, again, a downside, especially if one of the issues, by the way, in our region, and again, Southeast Asia is our region, is space on phones, right? So most of the low-end devices have smaller memory sizes, so you can't have that many large apps installed on your phone. So this becomes something to get a little bit worried about, but again, not an amazingly big deal when compared with the bigger picture. Offline support, you have completely native offline support, because even though you're writing JavaScript, at the end of the day, it's all being compiled to native. You have a complete set of native integrations, so that's looking super good. Cost of development is interesting because with things like React Native, you can use JavaScript developers, and React Native also uses the CSS concepts, CSS and JavaScript concepts, so that everything is familiar for them. And the turnaround time, because of this, the development time is still relatively short. There are a good amount of developers who are also using the web React that can also use React Native. So the React Native is one of the few libraries that has become very, very popular because of this. Because if you look at the cost development ratio and the performance ratio and all of that, you bring it together as a package, React Native kind of gives something that's pretty awesome. Finally, speed of iteration. Unlike hybrid, you can't update these on the fly. So you do have to publish a new version on the App Store and then get that approved for every time. So that's definitely one of the downsides for this. So I have separated out the compile to native, those three, and then Flutter. Flutter is the newest kid on the block. And this is slightly different in terms of how it does the work as compared to React Native and the other two. So Flutter is the UI framework from Google, and it's not just for iOS and Android, but it's meant to be a general UI tool for anything, right? So they're building their own operating system called Fuchsia that's expected to replace Android at some point in the future, and Flutter kind of powers everything that UI based on that platform, right? So super promising. It's built using a language called Dart, which is a completely new language, and it's especially optimized for this particular use case. That's also interesting. The way it works, however, so we talked about in React Native that, and all of the other platforms, that there's a JavaScript bridge that converts JavaScript code or C# code into the native code, and then it runs it. In Flutter, you convert Dart code to native code, but instead of handing it over to the OS to render it, Flutter takes control of that and has its own canvas. So it draws the thing for you. And what this does is it gives a little more predictability in terms of what's going to be drawn, and if there are any issues with debugging and things like that, you get a lot more control there. And you obviously get a small boost in performance as well, because now you don't have this bridge that you have to talk about. Now you can optimize when you're writing the Dart code, because you own both sides of the coin now, right? So you know how you're going to render it, you know how you're going to write it. So Flutter is interesting. It's again cross-platform. Actually, Flutter for web has come up as well. So that's also interesting, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. And so this is another option that's come into the market. It's gaining a lot of popularity. Let's see how this matches up with everyone else. So load time is faster because the bundle size are slightly smaller, but again, you still have to ship the Flutter compiler and all of the code with your app. So we still don't get as small as native. Runtime is faster than React Native. Again, when I say faster, you have to keep in mind that in most cases, you will not be able to tell the difference. It's only when you're pushing the limits of these platforms do you actually get to see the slight improvement. So in most cases, React Native is going to do fine, but in some cases, yes, Flutter might take the lead. Accessibility remains the same. File sizes are still relatively large because of obviously the Flutter compiler is being built in. Offline support, native integration, exactly the same. Cost of development is interesting. It's actually higher because Flutter devs are still very few. But if you look at speed of development, it's very similar to React Native because, again, you're just building a single code base for iOS and Android, right? So you're essentially reducing the time by half. And the final one is speed of iteration, which is, again, very similar to the others. You can't really update these on the fly. But what you do get is a very good, solid platform to build your app of. They have some pretty cool UI kits available around the material team and things like that. So definitely worth exploring if you're starting off an app, and just comparing this to React Native to see if this which ones to take forward. So this is something that I'm actually doing nowadays as well. Now, before we go to the final one, I just want to quickly touch on this uh, this important point of cross-platform development. Now, most people, when they talk about mobile apps and they start thinking, okay, I need an app, everybody's going to say, yes, I need apps on both Android and iOS, right? And that's, if you're building a consumer app, that makes sense because both have a pretty strong share. But at the same time, when you're trying to build one app that is getting deployed on two platforms, you need to start thinking about what's the impact of that. Because at the end of the day, iOS and Android are two very, very different platforms, right? And so the experience on them is very different, and you have to take that into account when you're building the app. So if you look at apps that give pure experiences like Airbnb or Instagram or Snapchat, these apps, again, can be built using hybrid apps or React Native or Flutter. But in order to give that experience, that very specific experience for each platform, you might have to end up having a lot of these conditions in your code that are specific to each platform, right? And that ends up making more of a mess than anything. So this does not pertain to most of the apps out there, but this is, again, an interesting point to think about, that is my app going to have the exact same experience on iOS and Android? Yes, then I think these cross-platform apps are amazing. But if you're looking to tweak, if you're looking to give a very unique experience for each of the platforms, then you might obviously want to fall back to native, right? And that essentially brings us to our native apps. And native apps nowadays are on iOS, we write all our code in Swift, and on Android, we write all our code in Kotlin. We have tools to build these apps. There is Xcode for iOS. There is the Android Studio for Android. When it comes to getting performance, when it comes to getting the best out of your platform, your OS, then there is obviously no replacement for native apps. But like I've said before, it really depends on what you're trying to build. And in most cases, that's just not a requirement, right? If you want a simple app that fills a form or shows some information to the user, performance is not a huge concern. So, but essentially, if you're building a game or if you're looking for the max level performance needed, then obviously native apps don't have a replacement. In terms of accessibility, it's interesting because the bundle size for these apps are smaller than compared to the compiled to native and hybrid apps, because you don't have those compilers and libraries with it. And at the same time, they are, though, larger than PWAs. PWAs are super, super small. So you're talking about 1 or 2 MB, where you can have a very, very small, like 5 or 6 MB app with a native app, and then you can have the 10 to 12 MB or 15 MB for the other platforms. Like this, that's the smallest size app that you can build for each of these, without essentially building a lot of code on top for your own. Offline support, native integration, all of this stuff. Obviously, now you are writing code from scratch, you're handcrafting stuff, so you can have the complete experience that you want to give to your users. Cost of development obviously is on the other side of the table now, because you have to hire both Android and iOS devs. It's twice as expensive to build. It's twice as slower to build. So all of this stuff needs to really take into account when you're building these apps. And finally, the speed of iteration is obviously going to be the same for a native app, because you have to get approval every time you publish to the App Store. So at the end of the day, we've gone through all the different apps, and we wanted, the question still remains though, right? Which platform is right for me? And that will completely depend on your requirements. And one of the requirements that I would really force you to consider, really push you to consider on, is what kind of resources, technical resources that you have. What kind of developers can you hire actually? Because at the end of the day, that is what makes the most difference. If you don't have good developers, even for native apps, you're going to make a really bad app. It's going to be slow, it's going to be buggy, it's going to crash, and doesn't really matter. And if you have a really, really good web developer, you can have a
ઢંગનું
PWA
કરી લે
that
કાંઈ.
is you can have a PWA that actually beats native apps, and you can't really tell if it's actually native or not. And for that, I would obviously suggest that you guys try out apps like Messenger Lite or Twitter Lite. I personally use Twitter Lite all the time, and I feel it's actually faster than the native app that comes on the Play Store for that. So that's the main one to think about, and that will also define your budget and your timeline. So that's usually the primary thing that comes into play, but all of the other factors that we've talked about are also important, and that at the end of the day really starts to think about what kind of app you're building in terms of, is it a consumer app, is it B2B, because B2B is a little more forgiving, is it something you're going to use internally in your factory or in your office. So as you move more further and further away, you'll realize that you can get away with just a simple PWA, and that just gives all the functionality that you want, and that just it costs about 20% of what a native app would. So so there's a lot of difference between these different types of apps, and if you know what you're going to build, at the end of the day, it really helps, and might save you a lot of money as well in the long run. And that was kind of it from my side. I'm happy to take any questions that you guys may have around this. And I'm also very open to discussing your apps with you guys if you want me to do that, and give you my thoughts on what sort of strategy you should be looking at. And obviously not on the call today, but feel free to reach out to me over email or Twitter or LinkedIn, and we can definitely have a discussion there. Thank you all for being here, and yeah, in case you have any questions, please let me know.
Okay, thank you so much, Mashhood, for delivering this beautiful session in regards of how to design a mobile strategy for our e-products. We have one question from you from Babar, and his question is related to payments native integration. Which approach is relatively better in terms of protecting user privacy, like personal and financial informations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when it comes to payments, one of the most popular way nowadays is to use in-app payments for your app, and that is super secure. It's super fast because you just have to usually put your finger on the on the on the sensor, and it authorizes the payment because everything else is saved. So in-app payments are not yet available on the PWA side, but they are coming very soon. So on Android, they are available. There's payments API that's available. On iOS, they have announced it this year. So fingers crossed, let's see what comes out of that. But everything beyond hybrid apps, in-app payments are available as an option. So yeah, if you're going with integrating payments, that's definitely the best way to go down.
Do we have another questions for Mashhood?
I think that's very well explained, Mashhood. Thank you very much. I was also checking, and I was thinking about a few questions, but when I was thinking the questions, you were also giving the answers during the session. So my questions were already answered. The only thing that I want to
Yes.
ask.
Sorry.
Okay. So Mashhood, the only question I want to ask that most of the end users, they are concerned to the performance and UI nowadays. The functionality, app functionality is definitely, that's another factor. But take an example, the usage time on the phone is very limited. For example, if we are not having a good speed or not having a good performance, so then definitely we switch the like app and we don't use it. It's very rapid nowadays. So all the different practices you mentioned, then the things, the strategies, those are not supporting the good performance. How these are working in the market, and are these currently working in different scenario for the market?
Yeah, so I think that's again a good question. And it's important to understand that performance is very, very relative to the kind of app that you're building, right? If your app is simply taking some data from a source and showing it, email is an example, right? If you have email client, that's not super computative, right? All it does is it renders a list and then shows some images and things like that. So when it comes to having simple UIs, then um, the throughout the spectrums, you'll see from web to native to hybrid to compiled to native, performance is generally not a big problem now. Web has caught up a lot, and if you write good code, then you're not going to run into any performance issues there. But if you want to be 100% sure that you don't want to run into performance, then it's always safe to start from compiled to native, because that's you are in the native territory. And as soon as you enter the native territory, then rendering becomes a multi-threaded operation. So you have a primary thread that's creating all of the stuff, making sure the animations are smooth, and then anything else that's happening is happening on other threads. So in terms of UI performance, yes, you will get the best performance at writing pure native code, that is iOS, Kotlin, and Swift. Uh, the least performant is web, but like I said, I mean, check out Twitter Lite and Facebook Lite and use them. You'll see that there used to be a time when web was really laggy and it wasn't, the feedback wasn't really good, but that has changed now, and you actually get a really good experience on these as well.
Okay. Thank you, Mashhood. That makes sense. Thank you. So,
Thank you, Mohsin, for putting up the question, and thank you, Mashhood Bhai, for us answering it. Well, the next question is from Salman, and his question is, how secure are there apps made by website which just make the wrapper of website on mobile? Maybe they are just calling website in mobile barrier browser. Again, how secure are they in your view?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I didn't want to get too technical in the session, so I haven't really brought this up yet. But so security is something that if you want to look at the implementation, you can essentially make every implementation secure and every implementation insecure, right? But it is a given that when you're on the web platform, things tend to slip up a little more often than on native platforms, because the native platforms ensure certain security things while you're doing it, right? So on the web, you do have to take care of all of the security things that we would normally do when we're building web apps, like XSS and um, the man in middle attacks and all of that stuff, right? So in terms of security, if you just look at from a layman's view, then you would consider web to be slightly less secure than native apps. That doesn't mean that it can't be as secure as native apps. It's just that, yes, you have to do some work in order to get to that point. So yeah, that's actually a very good question, and that's definitely something to also consider depending on what kind of app you have.
I hope, Salman, your question has been answered. Going next is Sobia is raising hand. Yes, Sobia, you can join, please, for your question.
Okay. Hello. My question is actually related to product development in agile way. So since it's an agility kind of platform, when we talk about agility and product development, we go for MVPs and proof of concept and all that stuff. And we also talk about versioning. My question is, what factors one should consider early on so that there is not a big architectural change later on? That's the question.
Yeah, that's a good question as well. And a lot of people are trying to create an app in form of an MVP that they can then reuse as a complete app further down the road without rewriting everything. So from a very layman perspective, a direct answer is that most people simply nowadays opt for React Native because of this. Because at the end of the day, you're writing some JavaScript code, you can prototype really fast, it's relatively cheap, you're building on both platforms. And at the end of the day, when you really want to scale up, you still have all the native functionality available. You have a pretty solid platform below it that will help it scale and grow out. So that's definitely there, and a lot of companies now tend to use that. But I will add that it doesn't have to be that way. And a lot of the companies also, when they're prototyping initially, and one of the most important things about product development is that over years, your product will change so much that at some point you will be thinking of rewriting it, right? Almost every big platform out there does go under that, does go through that rewrite process every few years. And that's just to catch up with technology and build stuff or rethink stuff or adjust things or reduce technical debt, whatever that is. So if you look at it from that perspective and you start from the least cost or the most cost efficient method, and then you slowly build upwards, yes, at some point, yes, you will have to do that architecture change, but then it's not a big deal because you have to do that anyway, whether because over time, understand that the product has evolved, and even if it was on pure native, you would still have to do it because the app has changed quite a bit and there's a lot of technical debt and you have to start from the beginning. So both sides of the coins are there, and again, really depends on the company and the kind of product you're working on. Either way, it can go in.
So I think there is a need of another session where we talk about some factors, related to product development strategy, a long-term strategy, or maybe defining some benchmark like how many users, and all that stuff. Where when we need load balancing and many stuffs are there. Okay, in start. I also know there is a trend. React native is very common nowadays. People just use it, but how the time period? I mean, how many users, and then the strategy. Maybe it's security for an app is very important, so we may need to take care security early on. And as you said, depend upon the app. Then there are video apps, chatting, and there are different types of. So, is there a possibility we have another session on this?
Yeah, definitely. So my session today was more of like a quick overview of all possible options, and
That's really informative.
yeah. So if you look at it from a product perspective, that is definitely like a whole other world where then you start thinking about all the different elements, and like you just said, about security, about the UI, about iteration. So
Experiences and everything.
That experiences all of that. Definitely, that's worth something to think about.
Thank you, Mashhood. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sobia. So if we are not bugging more time, I have two questions, one from Babar and from Omar. One question is that, Mashhood, in terms of usage tracking and users action tracking, all the approaches we covered are supported by Google Analytics sort of tracking platform. So what could be other platforms which are helpful for tracking these areas?
Yeah, so this is again one of the product-related questions. I'm normally falling under marketing side, and each type of platform. So tracking is split into two main sections: web and native. On the web, yes, Google Analytics is kind of the king, and with their cookies and everything, it's probably one of the best ways to track behavior. But in the mobile space, there was a whole different concept that came, I think it was around 2012. The company's called Mixpanel, and their concept is around tracking per user per user events. So instead of just tracking general events like how many users are coming and things like that, you're actually tracking individual user and what they're doing and how they're doing it. When Mixpanel came in, after a while, there was another company called Segment, and they're also very popular nowadays. And there's a host of many other companies that have now come into this space, including Amplitude and whatnot. So, and then most recently, Firebase Analytics has done a lot of work in this as well. So all of these SDKs, all of these tools are available usually for native integration, although they do have JavaScript SDKs for web as well. And from the core idea is not just to identify a user, but also try to understand what they're doing, why they're doing it, and really drill down into every single interaction that they're doing, so that you can get a better idea of how your app's being used and what are the important points and not. So again, because of how web and mobile are so different in terms of interactivity and in terms of consumption, so these analytic platforms are essentially made for mobile only. So that's why they track completely different things.
Great. So the last question is, like, in your experience, just developing in React Native as opposed to native negatively impacts certain aspect of the user experience. There is a cost and time saving advantage, like you mentioned. However, does it come at the cost of the user experience?
Yeah, so this is, as I mentioned, that this will again depend on what kind of app you're trying to build. So if you're trying to build a very highly complex game in React Native, again, unlikely, but if you're trying to do that, then yes, there is a chance that you might not be able to give the best user experience for that game because it might run into some performance bottlenecks. If you're trying to, again, show some data from your server to the user, or maybe take some input or something like that, then there is not much of a performance bottleneck, and React Native just performs really, really well in most cases. So, and this is the hard decision for most people. When you have all of these platforms lined up, in terms of choosing one, you can choose any of them, and it wouldn't make a difference. But at the end of the time, you just have to figure out what's that one place where I'm going to run into a problem with each of these platforms. So that requires some experience in having been worked with different apps to know, okay, these are possible places where the problems can come in. From a high level perspective, no, there's no major user experience impact. You can go out there. You've probably used Facebook's app on a daily basis. Yes, there is a slightly more probability that your app will crash, but that's mainly because of poor development practices than the platform itself. And that can also happen if your app is not properly written on a native platform. So from a high level perspective, that's not the case, but in some cases, yes, there might be an impact depending on your app.
Thank you so much, Mashhood Bhai, for elaborating the queries and questions from our participants. And moving ahead, we would like to thank you for taking out for time for us, for our community, and just to keep informed everyone that Mashhood Bhai is the one who has initiated the concept of community in Pakistan tech industry especially. And we are glad to have you on board, Mashhood Bhai, over here. So before moving forward and towards the ending part, we want to play this event, a tribute to one of our renowned personality in, you can say, in agile industry, and that is Farooq Afzal, who has shared a large contribution in agile industry, and obviously he was the part of PMI chapter Lahore and serving as a trainer and consultant. Is my screen shareable? Can you see my screen, guys?
Not yet. It's saying it has been shared, but it's not shared yet.
Okay.
It's shared now
All right.
and disappeared again.
I guess now it will
Yeah,
start sharing.
yeah, it's shared now.
Thank you. So this session is a tribute to Farooq Afzal as well. And we would like to pray for the demise family and for him. And remember remember him in your prayers. Plus, I would like Mohsin to come and speak some few words about him. Thank you.
Thank
Handing
you,
over to
Namra.
you. You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Navra. So, guys, this is another factor that from the community and being the countrymen, we should respect and we should definitely pay tribute to all those people who have contributed a lot in our industry. Farooq Afzal is one of the very nicest person I met. Even he was my instructor in my PMP training, and so far, like whoever met him, uh, he or she actually always they praised about his attitude and his modesty, and a very noble and very kind person. Unfortunately, he was also affected by the COVID a few days ago, and left with a daughter and his wife. So that was a very sad and very hurting situation, and we as a community we would like to pray for him. We will be trying some help to provide his family, although PMI Pakistan is trying to do that, but still whatever we can do, we will also do that. So far from being the community and from as a human point of view, we would like to pray for him, for his a good space in Jannah, and everything that we can do about that. So I would request all of you to pray. Please pray for him and remember him and his family in your prayers.
Thank you, Mohsen, for sharing your kind words for Farooq. And before signing off, again, thanks to the speaker, all to the participants who have given their time and participated over here. So next session is on next upcoming Saturday, 4th July 2020 by Amr Imam. And we are soon publishing his topic, and it's going to be really interesting, especially for our quality assurance industry. Thank you, everyone. Khuda Hafiz. Take care.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Mashhood. Allah Hafiz.